People have lived in the Madrid area since prehistoric times. Occupied by Romans, Moors and then the Spanish, it has quite the history. Over 6.8 million people live in Madrid, which is less than Paris and London, but more than Berlin. But of course a capital city will boast a few ghost stories. The ghosts of those executed for heresy and witchcraft in the Plaza Mayor are said to still haunt the square. A fire tore through the square in 1631, devastating the buildings and leaving people dead, and some wondered if the square had attracted some kind of evil energy. So which other ghosts lurk in this beautiful city? Let's explore 3 of the most famous legends and their variations in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are bringing to a close. I'm sure this is the 3rd time I've done European cities for my theme, and we're finishing off with Madrid. And I do like Madrid, but I was there in about 2003, so unlike some of the more recent episodes like Dublin and Florence, which have been within the last sort of 6 months to a year, this one obviously is a long time since I've been there. But I did really like Madrid. It is a really beautiful city, so we're going to finish off with that. And doing ghost stories for this one rather than wider legends provides a lovely bridge into next month's theme, which obviously is ghosts. So we're going to start off with hauntings at the Reina Sofia Museum. And this is an art gallery, and it's quite interesting because I know obviously I've done things like haunted libraries, haunted hospitals and things like that. And it's amazing how many museums and art galleries do seem to have ghosts attached to them. So I thought that was quite an interesting place to start. And the Reina Sofia Museum stands in the Calle Santa Isabel, although the building was not originally intended as an art museum, because it actually dates to the 16th century when King Felipe II commissioned the San Carlos Hospital. Not only would this hospital cure the sick, it would also provide a home for the destitute. However, it also became the kind of hospital you really didn't want to go to, as there was a good chance you'd never leave alive. In the 18th century, King Carlos III decided to build a new building, since the original building was well over capacity, and it seems that they saw almost 14,000 patients every year. Building work ground to a halt in 1788, and the hospital continued to function in what had been built so far. Now, it actually continued to function until 1965, when the hospital was finally closed, but the city declared the building a national monument in 1977. Restoration began in 1980, with the Art Centre opening in 1986, and I think probably one of the most famous works in this particular museum is Pablo Picasso's famous work, Guernica. But according to legend, construction workers found human remains in the grounds as they worked on the new art centre, and it seemed that they'd been buried during the building's time as a hospital. Somewhat disturbingly, shackles and chains also turned up alongside the skeletons. Even more strange, workers found 3 mummified nuns in the former chapel. I will say that the articles I looked at do vary in how they describe that particular discovery, and in some places it's more 3 bodies were found behind a wall. In other places they describe them having been mummified, and I think they mean in the sense that when a body dries out due to the climate rather than the process of mummification that you'd find in ancient Egypt, just to clarify that one. But it is quite interesting that these 3 figures show up in lots of the articles, but just how they were found varies. Now, the people who'd worked in the building admitted that they'd experienced a whole range of weird phenomena, like screams and whispering in empty rooms, doors that opened on their own, lifts that operated without human intervention, and alarms ringing for no reason. Clearly, you do sometimes have to wonder if there's an electrical issue if you've got things like lifts moving on their own and alarms ringing on their own. You do sort of think both of those things could potentially be caused by a fault with what actually powers them, but again, never having actually been. It could also just be there's something really creepy going on. And indeed, there are plenty of witness reports, and cleaners have seen figures sitting on benches at the start of the early morning shifts. Security guards hear doors slam shut on the night shift. Other witnesses actually say that they've seen 3 nuns walking slowly around the building, and they sing as they walk. The nuns then vanish at the end of the corridor, leaving only the faint sound of bells in their wake. I mean, as far as sightings go, that actually sounds relatively benign. But in the 1990s, a group of guards brought a Ouija board to work to test the rumours, and according to them, they contacted a spirit who'd been a hospital patient but also a murderer, and he warned that they would suffer a great misfortune in a couple of days' time. A few days later, one of the guards lost a close relative in a traffic accident, and then another guard actually filed a complaint about this particular spirit. The HEPTA group of paranormal investigators arrived in 1992, and they also brought along a priest, physicist, a journalist, an architect, and a photographer, which I quite like because at least it shows that they're sort of covering all of their bases, but also trying to bring along people who might be able to find more of a practical or physical explanation for phenomena, which sometimes with paranormal investigation, you're trying to rule out the obvious as much as you're actually trying to find evidence of the paranormal, or at least you should be if you're doing it properly. But this group actually explored the underground corridors as well, and according to their reports, they saw shadow figures, experienced locked doors just unlocking and then opening on their own, and nuns and monks drifting around. In 1995, they did a second investigation, and it seems that the experiences kind of repeated more of the same, but then there was another big story about a haunting in Madrid that broke, which we will cover last, and that one seemed to overshadow the 1995 report, so it's a little bit of a shame that there doesn't seem to be much more beyond that. And some people do say that the same issues continue to plague the museum, so it does make you wonder, is it the original destitute inhabitants of the hospital, or is it the dead who were buried in the grounds? It's obviously difficult to say. The fact that people see 3 nuns, and there were supposedly these 3 nuns found in the chapel, obviously they would appear to be linked in some way, but what I would like to know is, were people seeing the 3 nuns before they found the 3 bodies in the chapel, or is it one of those things where people see 3 nuns because they know that 3 were found? Another one of these things that you have to bear in mind with such stories. But I thought it was a really interesting collection of phenomena where a lot of them sound quite familiar, like doors opening on their own and things like that, but to have them all concentrated in an art gallery obviously made it a little bit more unusual. And I think it sounds like people are more or less almost possibly used to it now. I'm not sure, but if you're in Madrid, go and have a look and see if anything happens and let me know. When I went to Madrid, the only art gallery we went to was the Prado, so I really wish I'd gone to the Reina Sofia Museum as well. But we're going to move on to story number 2, which is the House of the 7 Chimneys. And this legend concerns a 16th century house in the Plaza del Rey, which has, as you might imagine, 7 chimneys. And the Spanish Ministry of Culture is based there now, although obviously, as with any old building, a range of legends exist about it. There's various versions of this story, so it's quite difficult to try and straighten out which is the actual legend and which ones are just remixes. So I'm going to try and give it its best a shot as I can and indicate where there are variations. But if you have heard a different version, I'm not surprised because there are so many knocking around. But the main one that I seem to find was that a young noblewoman named Elena lived in this particular house, and she was a daughter of one of King Felipe II's servants. Sometimes she's the daughter of one of his hunters, and so on. It gets quite confused. But either way, she married an army captain. But as usually happens in these stories, he went off to war against Flanders, but never returned. And not long after she got the news about the captain's death, Elena herself died. The strange circumstances of her death prompted plenty of rumours, especially since her body disappeared. Now, some people think that she died of a broken heart or that grief somehow killed her, and there's lots of discussions and some legends about the way that she essentially stopped eating and kind of wasted away. But then there are other ones that go on about all the stab wounds and so on that our body suffered, which is interesting because if our body disappeared, I'm not sure how anyone would have that level of forensic detail of the wounds that she suffered. So this is where it starts to get a little bit wiggly, if that makes sense. So as I say, you've got some people blaming grief. Other people say that she'd been murdered, most likely by her father, although no one could explain why, because he actually died soon after his daughter, making it less likely that he was the culprit. Although in some stories he was actually hung from one of the chimneys. In other stories he was basically blamed to hide the real murderer's identity. And this is probably because most people think that she'd been having an affair with a royal, possibly even King Felipe II himself. And these particular rumours see her bear a child with the king rather than with her husband, and the king then had them both killed to hide the truth. That to me doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because as she was married when she had the child, passing it off as the child of the captain would obviously make far more sense as far as I'm concerned, but there we go. Other versions of the story claim that Felipe II built the house as somewhere to hide an illegitimate daughter, because when the building was built, the area would have been fairly rural, so it would have essentially been more of a country retreat, which would have made it a good place to hide someone. And then Madrid's obviously expanded and grown up around it as the years have gone by. In this particular legend, being locked away all the time drove the daughter to madness and she died. No cause of death is given, although some people believe that she now haunts the house. So in this case, it's not someone who's been having an affair with the royal, it's the illegitimate daughter of the royal. Either way, people swore that a ghost wandered the roof, flitting between the chimneys in white, carrying a torch. Some witnesses also claim that she points at the royal palace as if pointing at her murderer. Other sightings claim a female figure appears in the bedroom thought to be Elena's before she then vanishes from sight. And there is also a legend in which it's not Elena that haunts the roof, but rather her daughter, having been driven mad by knowing she was actually Felipe's daughter and then had been abandoned by him. So again, lots of different variations here, but the general nub of it seems to be the ghost of this female figure appearing on the roof and somehow being in and around the chimneys. So that seems to be the central point. Who the figure is the point of contention. And the Banco de Castilla took over the building in the 1880s and they did some renovation work, which was obviously necessary to turn a private house into a commercial property. And they apparently found female bones in the cellar along with 16th century coins. No one knows who the bones belong to, but it is possible that the finding of these bones then fueled the various rumours about Elena. And it also doesn't help that people say the 7 chimneys represent the 7 deadly sins. Now our final story is going to be the tragedy of the Linares Palace, which is actually now the Casa de America. And it was built at the end of the 19th century and it was a fabulously grand mansion until the Spanish Civil War, when it was abandoned. Now again, this story gets a little bit confusing because obviously there's different variations and so on. But the general nub of it is that we have a young man called Joseph who was the son of the Marquis of Linares, and he fell in love with a woman called Raimunda. Various versions of the story claim that she was the daughter of a humble cigarette maker. Or was she? Because Joseph's father Matteo was absolutely dead set against Joseph marrying Raimunda. Joseph didn't know if it was because she was from a lowly background or if there was some kind of other reason for Matteo's dislike of her. Now, Matteo was the kind of wealthy that's actually obscene, so class would seem like a likely motive for him thinking that Raimunda wasn't a good choice for his son. Matteo then sent Joseph to London to study, clearly hoping that he would forget Raimunda in the process. Except Joseph did quite the opposite and married Raimunda in 1858, the year after his father died. When going through his letters, Joseph found papers that explained Matteo's dislike of the match, and it turned out that he'd had an affair with Raimunda's mother, making Raimunda Joseph's half-sister. Now obviously this completely destroyed any hope that Joseph and Raimunda had for a happy ever after, but despite knowing the truth, they still loved each other and they were also still legally married. So they did consider asking for a papal bull that would let them continue living together as long as they lived lives of chastity. Except that wasn't going to happen either, because the legend claims that they'd already had a daughter together. As one version of the story goes, they murdered her to hush up the scandal. Now, in some versions of the legend that I found, Raimunda died and then Joseph followed 5 months later, and officially they died without children, although the legend obviously contradicts that. The ghost story part of it claims that the little girl still haunts the palace, singing to herself and calling for her parents. Bear in mind, obviously, the palace is no longer a palace, is now actually in use as a commercial property. But visitors apparently hear disembodied whispers and see strange shadows in the palace. In the 1990s, Tiempo magazine claimed that they had EVP recordings from inside the palace. Listeners believed they could distinguish 3 different voices on the recordings, believed to be those of a family. The youngest voice, that of a little girl, apparently yelled, "I don't have a mum." And this is the story that apparently overshadowed a lot of the investigation at the Reina Sofia Museum, because obviously people were then fascinated by what on earth had been going on at the Linares Palace. Now, some people point out that no one has actually found any evidence to show that Joseph and Raimunda were actually related at all. And other people say there was also no evidence that they ever had a child either. So it is entirely possible that they were never related and Matteo had some other issue why he didn't like them. It could also just simply be that someone's put about a story that they were actually half siblings just because they didn't like the fabulously wealthy. You know, it could be any number of reasons like that. And it does then make it difficult to then pinpoint who the ghost of the little girl would be because of the relative newness of the building as far as we can tell. However, there's nothing saying that obviously the little girl didn't belong to a previous site or a previous building that stood there. So it's interesting that people have actually looked for evidence to see how much of this story is actually true. So while we do know that Joseph and Ramunda existed, and we know that Matteo existed, there's no way to know if there was any familial connection between them at all, or indeed if they would then kill their own child to hide any idea of a scandal or anything like that. It's a really sad story, and I do think that calling it a tragedy is a good one, but at the same time there's no evidence that there was actually a tragedy, and this could have just been a couple who died without children and people then just made stuff up. It's difficult to know really with this one. But it is fascinating, I think, how there's a focus in these latter two stories on female ghosts. Obviously, in one case, it's the little girl in the House of the Seven Chimneys. It's either the grief-stricken widow or the illegitimate daughter of a royal, whichever version you choose to pick for that one. And I think there is something almost appealing about female ghosts in these stories, particularly when you consider the number of white lady and grey lady ghosts that you come across in stories right around the world. Like, they're such common figures to come across. And I think that it's a way to almost preserve female pain in a way, and to actually acknowledge it, and to acknowledge that these people may not have actually lived particularly fun or rewarding lives, or indeed long lives in the case of the little girl. So it is fascinating that there is this fascination with female ghosts. The Reina Sofia Museum, on the other hand, obviously then points to mass trauma and what exactly happens when you have a site that has so much death and disease happening on it, really. What kind of ghosts are you then going to collect somewhere like that? So what I want to know is, which of these Madrid ghost stories did you enjoy the best? Madrid, as I said at the beginning, is a beautiful city that's well worth a visit. And I didn't even mention the fact that there's a fountain of the fallen angel in the Retiro Park, who's often considered the only public monument to the devil himself. And it captures the moment Lucifer is cast from heaven, and it was installed at its current location in 1885. Interestingly, I took several photos of this statue when I visited Madrid in 2003, because the way that Lucifer has been presented, basically it's one of those like sexy depictions of Lucifer. So he's a handsome angel in this at the point that he's fallen. It was a really interesting way that it was done in the sculpture. But what was really bizarre is all of the photos have vanished. And I've got plenty of other photos from that trip, but not the ones of that particular fountain, which is really, really weird. I've looked everywhere that there could possibly be. And bearing in mind, this is 2003. These are pictures that I took on a film camera, and I can't even find the negatives. So I've potentially just put them somewhere and forgotten where. But it is really weird that I can find certain photos from that trip, but those particular ones of that fountain have just disappeared. So who knows what happened to them. But I thought that was quite a weird interaction with Madrid. But I do want you to remember these Madrid ghost stories when you're strolling through the Plaza Mayor, particularly given its reputation for being haunted. But of course, as with any major city, keeping that many people in close proximity for so long is bound to create jumbled energy. And who knows who or what that energy might interact with. So please do let me know if you've ever visited Madrid. Obviously, if you like Spain, I do also have an episode of Barcelona ghost stories as well, if that tickles your fancy. And next week we are going to move on to ghosts. We're going to start off with poltergeists, because I suddenly realised that I've mentioned spirits before that pop up in folk tales and ghost stories as a type of ghost, but I've never really explored them in much more detail than that. So we're going to start off with poltergeist, and then we're going to be looking at various other things to do with ghosts and what have you next month, because it's all in celebration of the release of Ghost Law, my next book with DK, on August the 7th. And you can pre-order that. The link is in the show notes. There is an unboxing, well, it's actually an unenveloping on Instagram if you're curious to see what the artwork looks like, because if you remember Rebel Folklore, the artwork was phenomenal, and it's just as good in Ghost Law. It's just a very different style, so, and I think it really suits the text and the tone of the book really well. So if you want to have a look at what it looks like, you can go and see that. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what people make of this one. Some of the ghost stories in it are genuinely creepy, and some of the ghosts are just downright nasty. So it's quite an interesting mix of figures this time, compared to Rebel Folklore, where there was that more of that focus on, there is nuance, there are grey areas, and in this one, sometimes there are, and then other times it's like, yeah, no, this is just horrible. So there is that to bear in mind. So hopefully you'll enjoy that as well. And also, my last announcement, if you're around on Monday evening at 6 p.m. British Standard Time, I'm doing another online talk for free with Cresswell Craggs about star lore. So we'll be having a look at some of the legends behind some of the constellations and things like that. So that one, as I say, you can click on the link to reserve your tickets, basically so that you'll get sent the Zoom link. Donations are always welcome because it does help with the upkeep of Cresswell Craggs. But otherwise, as I say, it will be absolutely marvellous to see you there. And the link for that is in the show notes as well. Other than that, I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week when we actually have a look into the poltergeist and where the idea of poltergeist may have come from. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.